I want to talk about the image quality. Now, no matter how good the retoucher is, one of the main things you need to worry about before you even begin working on the pixels or anything on the image is in what shape the image is. You need to think about your input. And because when you think about it, no matter how good retoucher you are, unless you make creating an image from scratch, in which case you're not a retoucher anymore, your output will be relative to the input. In other words, depending on the image quality when it was captured and all the potential problems you might have, it's going to result how much work you spend as well as how the end result will look once you're done. So let's take a look at some of the key elements real quickly and really briefly that you need to worry about before you even begin working on an image. And knowing, is it even worth it to work on an image and what approach you're going to take, that's one of the key skills of any experienced retoucher. So let's take a look. Composition. What does that mean? Well, that means that you can potentially crop certain areas within the image and save yourself some work. You can crop areas that are not relevant to good composition as the end image, as the end result, and therefore save yourself time in trying to fix those areas or trying to retouch those areas. You should also think about exposure. Now, exposure shouldn't be, especially if you're working with the raw file, it shouldn't be more than 1, maybe 2 f-stops below or above your ideal exposure setting. If you're working with JPEG and TIFF, then that's a bit of a problem. Exposure should always be dead on, or at least try to be something close to it. Now, if you have a chance, I would suggest that you work on a raw file, and this is why. If you're not working with the raw file, then your camera decides what it is that's going to do to the image to prepare it. So it basically does pre-production work for you. It interpolates the image, it adds white balance, contrast, saturation, sharpness, and all that stuff. And the main difference, as you can see, between JPEG and TIFF is that with JPEG, it applies lossy compression. And depending on the level of compression, you can introduce some JPEG artifacts. While with the TIFF file, you usually don't have any compression. But all of the settings like white balance, contrast, and all that stuff is already locked within the file once it's produced and comes out of your camera. But with raw files, now here you have incredible amount of flexibility because everything that your camera sensors has been able to capture is maintained within the raw file. That's why they call it the raw file. This, of course, gives you the biggest amount of flexibility, but it also requires a user, in this case the retoucher or yourself, to do some of your own post-processing before you even introduce the image into the Photoshop, before you even begin dodging and burning in the real sense of the word. So basically, before you even begin doing that process, you need to determine what would be the white balance, the contrast, saturation, all that stuff. You can do that after in Photoshop after you have developed your RAW, but why not take advantage of the awesome power of the RAW file? You should also think about sharpness, or how much in focus or out of focus your image is. Because if it's not properly focused, then texture is, especially the kind of texture you want to work when you're dodging and burning, is compromised. You don't see it. I would suggest that you try to obtain a certain sharp image which is properly focused. And especially if you're trying to practice dodging and burning, or if you're trying to come up with something that deserves the treatment of dodging and burning. Also, as far as the resolution goes, well, resolution is totally irrelevant if you're doing this for the web. If you're doing this for the print, then you need to worry about the output resolution, and that's dependent on the device. But you should really concern yourself with pixel dimensions, to have enough pixel dimensions so that it will match desired output. And speaking of output, that can be either print or web, or it can be both. Now, you should concern yourself with noise, but this is becoming less and less of a problem these days, because even though noise happens when you have a usually high ISO setting on your camera, with today's cameras who are getting better and better at defeating this noise already, as well as good software solutions to reduce the noise after the image was captured, this is not something that will give you too much trouble, I suspect, especially if you're working with higher end images, but just make sure that your image is not too noisy. You should also think about and worry yourself about banding and posterization. Now, banding is something that might happen when you have smooth gradients on your image. For instance, if you have a nicely graduated sky, or if you have maybe the kind of background that you can find in a studio setting, that's where you might see banding. And you can, I guess, work with banding by working and developing image in 16-bit, or you can introduce some noise while post-processing to blend in with the banding pattern, and that way you can mask it. But I would suggest that if you can avoid it, you try to work on images that don't have too much banding. And the same thing goes for posterization, which can sometimes happen when you have very hard lighting, hard contrasty lighting, hard transitions between shadow and highlights. If you're going to practice or work dodging and burning on a pixel level, then you should make sure that you have decent looking skin texture, so that the whole effort is going to paid off. And because if you don't have any skin texture, then dodging and burning on that level, it just doesn't work. You don't have anything to show all that hard effort you're going to put in the technique. If the image is far away from the camera, if the subject is far away from the camera, then texture may not be so relevant, but you still want some kind of texture. You do want it to look natural as possible, unless you're gauging for that special, maybe glamour or some other type of look. And you should also try to find out if there are any alternative images from the set that you can use. For instance, if your original image is maybe great posture of the model, great gesture, great composition, everything, but maybe it's overexposed, something that you can't even fix with the raw file. Well, maybe the photographer took the same image in slightly shifted state, maybe slightly different pose of the same model, maybe a split second later. And you can borrow that image to fix areas that are overexposed. Or maybe the photographer has managed to crop the image so that maybe certain fingers of the model are missing from the frame. And you want to borrow those from the next set, from the next image within the set. And you can also borrow certain elements, like maybe pieces of hair, or you can even borrow skin texture, and we'll talk about that more later on. You can borrow certain skin texture from different images and apply it to your own. If the original one has certain elements, certain parts of the image where there is no skin texture, that's going to be like a bonus technique, and it can sometimes be useful if you don't have any other options.